was 13 or 14 years old. And like Steve, I'm a scholar, which was fortunate in this case because the suddenness of his passing was shattering. So in order for me to be able to do this, I had to do what Steve would have done. I wrote out my thoughts. So if you'll indulge me, it'll take me about 6 minutes to read this. And I see these kids that I knew as little kids looking at me. Will you indulge me that long?
Yes, sir. Take all the time you need.
Steve, I hope you'll appreciate this. Yes, I'm 52, which is why I had to take my glasses off. It's called Restless Spirit. To talk or correspond with someone who I care about one day, then attend their funeral or memorial service the next day, is something that I've always found very difficult to accept. However, since I've done this more times than I would like, I have some sense of what Steve's family, particularly his sons, are feeling, and that's why I agreed to say a few words. Traditionally, scholars begin by obtaining a master's and/or a doctorate degree. Then they teach at one or more colleges and universities, where they climb aboard the professional treadmill toward a tenured professorship by publishing articles in referee journals, which are designed to bring distinction to the institution. They join professional societies, and they present at their conferences, and engage in the peculiar and usually dispiriting politics of the academy, which Steve told me is a polite form of blood sport. Steve followed this traditional path of scholars, even though he was at his core a decidedly non-traditional man. He taught at Antioch, Chicago State, Michigan, Vassar, Wittenberg, and Worcester, and not only published in academic journals, but he also edited a few, including the Worcester Review, which he kindly asked me to copy edit. He presented at academic conferences, and even though he hated it, he engaged in university politics and was victimized by them at several universities, most notably at Chicago State, where he was sacked as the academic advisor of the innovative Tempo student newspaper, which compelled him to successfully sue that school. I don't know if Steve knew it, but it was chiefly because of these latter unhappy experiences that I loved and respected him and considered him a spiritual brother. You see, Steve was a restless spirit, and much like the haints or ghosts of his native South Carolina. In black culture, the visitations of a haint are often connected with some injustice that was unaddressed, or more precisely, unavenged in life. And this is what motivated Steve. A profound commitment to expose the injustices done to black people in the past and the present. However, unlike most black scholars, Steve's efforts, both in the academy and in the community, were not designed to prick the supposed consciousness of the wrongdoers, but were intended to heal the damaged psyches and tortured souls of their black victims. My own commitment is as profound as Steve's, who, growing up in humble circumstances in the opportunity-killing caste system known as Jim Crow, had a much longer and harder path to tread. Steve's commitment was forged in the struggle of his youth, and particularly during his years in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which scholars are finally beginning to rightfully credit as the chief battering ram that brought down the walls of Southern Jim Crow racial segregation and its more subtle and insidious northern cousin of Jane Crow discrimination. But Steve was not a product of SNCC's early years as an idealistic interracial organization of college students pledged to nonviolence and dedicated to the dream of racial integration. Instead, he cut his eye teeth in the black freedom struggle after SNCC Field Secretary Willie Ricks and Stokely Carmichael, the group's new chairman, raised the stirring and controversial call for black power, or black self-determination, during the Mississippi March in June of 1966. After this, SNCC evolved into a battle-hardened, all-black organization which both advocated and practiced self-defense, armed if necessary, and sought to transform the forced expediency of racial segregation into the self-conscious power of black solidarity. But even within this vital crucible of black struggle, Steve remained his own man. Indeed, so much so that he dared breach one of its newfound taboos. He not only dated a white woman, he married her.
Twice.
However, had some of Steve's objecting comrades bothered to get to know Nancy, they would have quickly recognized that she was as non-traditional as he was and was no less committed to his freedom aims. But while the Southern rights struggle led Steve to this non-traditional path of psychic and spiritual liberation, it was his membership in a select group of young black men, mostly from Detroit, which would forever anchor him to it. You see, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, he became one of Ma's boys. Forgive me, I'm one of Ma's boys too, so this is not easy. Naomi Oden, known as Ma Oden, was, along with her husband, the co-founder and director of the Elmhurst home on Linwood at Elmhurst on Detroit's near west side. Like Dexter, a few blocks east, and 12th Street, now Rosa Parks Boulevard, a few blocks west, Linwood was a seething corridor of black frustration, despair, and anger. Appreciate that. All being the product of the white power structure's destruction of the mostly African-American Black Bottom residential district and the Black and Jewish Paradise Valley commercial and entertainment district on the city's Near East Side. Under the excuse of urban renewal, which black people understood to be Negro removal, the white power structure used the construction of the I-75 or Chrysler Freeway, designed to ferry fearful white suburbanites to and from downtown without having to encounter Detroit's new black inner city core. It sliced into the throbbing jugular vein of these communities, destroying Hastings Street, among others. The resulting residential hemorrhage soon displaced what was left of the near west side's old Jewish community and created a new black ghetto, and worse, a slum. This forced immigration soon produced or aggravated all the social ills that later characterized this area, including overcrowding and substandard housing, inferior schools, gouging merchants, absentee landlords, and particularly after this area rose up in rebellion in 1967, drug addiction. Indeed, it was these unjust conditions that fueled the rebellion. The Elmhurst Home then was designed to perform on-site triage and rehabilitation, in the broadest sense of that term, in this wounded community, and particularly to black boys and young men. To assist her in this mission, Ma Oden collected around her groups of black boys, adolescents, and young men who she felt showed particular promise, and she had both a keen eye for and a unique gift for nurturing it. Steve was one of these, as was his hero Richard Thomas, and his friend Henry, or H.R. Lewis, who later introduced me to the group and to Steve. I first met them at Ma Oden's house on Moss and 2nd Avenue in Highland Park. When H.R. and I walked in, a meeting was already in progress, and I was struck by the almost severe earnestness and grave focus of the participants, about a half dozen in number. Everyone spoke in hushed tones. The young men hunched forward on Ma's long couch, and Ma, as always, erect before them as mother teacher. According to H.R., she called these meetings deepenings, a term borrowed from her Baha'i faith, which most of the group, including Richard, Steve, and H.R., later embraced. Deepenings were designed to help one explore their inner spiritual contradictions in order to be more balanced and effective in all aspects of life. For Ma, who had the features and long dark hair of a Native American and the spirit of a warrior, being effective was the most important thing because she was all about social transformation, or perhaps better, soulful transformation. It was clear to me from the start that Richard was the senior member and titular head of the group. As such, he usually had little to say, but was always accorded great respect for whatever he chose to share. Steve, who was not shy about idolizing Richard, seemed intent on being seen to make a contribution to whatever discussion was at hand, and usually did so because he had a quick mind, was articulate, and in a hurry passionate. H.R. was mature beyond his years, and I've come to believe that part of the reason for this was Ma's solicitous tutelage. Although he was younger than both Richard and Steve, Ma always treated him as one of their peers, and he spoke and acted accordingly. For my part, I tried, until Ma pulled me out, to remain unnoticed, feeling quite intimidated by the seriousness of this group, which to all appearances was plotting a revolution. As I would soon learn, they were, because following Ma's cue, they had dedicated themselves to revolutionizing black men's view of their own worth as the first step towards revolutionizing their social realities, or again, to be more precise, to help black males mature into black men. In this, Ma was fierce. By this time, some of the group, including Richard and Steve, were beginning to have children, and I remember Steve discussing with Ma some of the problems that he was having with one of the boys. Ma turned steely, and her right arm shot out toward the street. Every black child, she said, is your child. I want to repeat that. Every black child is your child. Steve merely shook his head at the reminder because he had come to share her commitment that all black children are the common responsibility of all black men. During these meetings, Steve and I were first drawn together because of our mutual admiration of Shoghi Effendi, who headed the Baha'i faith after the passing of its founder, Abdu'l-Bahá. We felt that Shoghi Effendi was in effect the Malcolm X of the Baha'i faith because of his uncompromising stand for truth and justice. Ma had copies of his speeches, which we carefully pored over for insights that might be helpful to our own struggle for justice. This is also where I began to learn in fragmentary confessions how shattering Steve's youth was. He was left with gnawing doubts about his identity, his self-worth, and his potential, despite his natural brilliance. After all, he grew up in a place and at a time in which black people were taught to reject their blackness and embrace an empty, quote, humanity, unquote, that was sullied by their oppression and had no connection with anything or anyone that had any worth. Therefore, it made sense to me that he would later be drawn to two black writers who he actually bore a striking resemblance to both physically and intellectually. James Baldwin, on whom he wrote his dissertation, and Dr. Harold Cruz, who he befriended and assisted in the collection of his vast writings on modern black culture. For what it's worth, I consider Baldwin to have been one of the three genuine prophets of the 1960s, the other two being Malcolm X and Gil Scott-Heron. And as I told him on more than one occasion, I consider Dr. Cruz to have possessed one of the finest black minds of the latter half of the 20th century. Like Steve, both men were brilliant, but plagued with self-doubt. In Baldwin's case, this included self-hatred, because he had the added complication of being a homosexual in two cultures, African American and Caucasian American, that were intolerant of this aspect of his humanity. It was frankly painful to watch Steve, in his dissertation and in seemingly endless ruminations about it, grapple with Baldwin's ambivalent status as an outsider who craved both the company and the acceptance of his people. But the same people who were prone to judge and reject him despite his signal, literary, and rhetorical contributions to their freedom struggle. Dr. Cruz's isolation was more self-imposed than Baldwin's, but the roots of his alienation were much the same. He too made enormous contributions to his people's freedom struggle, particularly in the crisis of the Negro intellectual, his magisterial 1967 meditation on the history of modern black struggle as seen through the lens of black culture, yet he too remained an outsider. I don't know if Steve's family is aware of it, but his crisis, which was complicated by a difficult and finally failed marriage, was sometimes so severe that I worried that he might take his life, and I shared my concern with HR. I concluded that, while Steve was struggling to forge a secure cultural identity to tether himself to, his beloved boys gave him the grounding, literally his reason to be. Through his study of Baldwin's and Dr. Cruz's intellectual and emotional crises, I think that Steve discovered at least some of the causes of his own alienation, but unlike them, he learned to reconnect, or at least maintain his connection with his roots. In the rarefied climes of the academy, Steve managed to keep hold of his blackness, which, as I learned from him, was no mean feat. That one would even subject oneself or himself to have to negotiate this has always baffled me, but Steve, whenever we discussed it, was always deeply compassionate about those who, for whatever reason, were so situated. More than this, he worked hard to create spaces on campus for other black people to also maintain their cultural connections, as he did in the case of HR's daughter, Shamar, whom Steve looked after when she was at Vassar. When Steve recently returned to Ann Arbor from Chicago, I was not surprised to learn that he began making regular forays to Detroit, which had never recovered from the rebellion. This is what allowed us to reconnect after, I'm sure, more than a decade. On April 11th, we had lunch at Union Street in Detroit's Midtown district, and were joined by his son, Aaron, who I initially didn't recognize because he was all grown up. After a meal that was considerably enriched by our discussion, where we caught each other up, including on the passing of Nancy, I invited Steve and Aaron to attend a meeting of the Concerned Citizens for Democracy and the collective group that was fighting the state takeover of Detroit, which was meeting downtown. At the meeting, I proudly introduced Steve as my brother and Aaron as my nephew. As he had done decades before at my Oden's, Steve carefully considered all that was said, asked pertinent questions, and made helpful suggestions, including about the group's name. I later learned that Steve was already deeply involved in attempting to bring about a level of coordination between Detroit's still vibrant but scattered cultural artists and institutions, including those that featured its beloved jazz, believing, as in the past, that culture was the key to psychic and spiritual healing. Indeed, when I attempted to refer him to people and institutions that might prove helpful, I learned that he was already working with them. Indeed, he told me about some I didn't know, and I live in Detroit. I didn't tell Steve what a joy it was to watch him interacting with black people that day. For the first time in all the decades that I knew him, he was truly comfortable in his own skin, which made him even more comfortable with his people. To my mind then, this is Steve's legacy. This restless spirit, this scholarly ain't, spent a lifetime fighting to maintain what this society sought to deny him and all who look like him, namely a connection to a sense of worthiness, personal and cultural. Through this struggle, which could have ended his life long before now, and has cost and will cost countless others their lives, Steve managed to knit together a spiritual and cultural connection within himself, which through his academic and community work, he extended to connecting others with their worthiness. That is, Steve's torture became our blessing. For this, all I can say is, thank you, brother. We needed it, and we still do. I trust that at last, your restless spirit has found its rest. Thank you.
Would anyone else like to offer their remembrance?
You can keep it on if you want to. I'm gonna let you
Please come up.